morning, everyone. Could I ask the stragglers at the coffee point to get their refreshments and head to a seat? Colleagues at Steer. Welcome, everyone. We are a minute or two away from starting. We have a little bit of a run-up at our start this morning. We just need to make sure that our couple of hundred guests online are properly connected. So we'll just make sure that is all in good order, and then we will crack on. So just bear with us for 30 seconds or so, and then we will start today's session, which is the third of Steer's sessions, titled The Rethink Rooms. And thank you all for coming to focus on, to hear about a really important topic of the day. So we're good. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Rethink Rooms by Steer. Hello to colleagues, guests and speakers here in the room, and hello to 150 or so of you online. Thank you for joining us today. We're really pleased to be back hosting events at Steer, and as I think we'll discover when we hear from our speakers and participate in the subsequent discourse, we're gathered at a very timely moment to consider these topics. The Rethink Rooms by Steer is a programme of global events that's designed to shine bright light and fresh perspective on the issues of the day. It's a programme that's not designed to go back over old ground. It's designed to find new boundaries, new perimeters in our thinking, and leave us all as professionals with something to take away, something that we've learnt, something that we can put into practice. Our previous series of rail events actually started here in 2009 when we were considering with Lord Adonis the future of high-speed rail in the UK. In 2016 we considered sort of optimum structures in the rail industry with Howard Smith, Andrew Haynes and Stephen Gardner, currently CEO of Amtrak, and we also mark the 10-year anniversary of the Better Stations report. But this is a different session. It happens at a different time, and I think it happens at a time when there is the need for exploration of the role of the railways and the contribution of the railways. And undoubtedly, as we look back and consider some of our sort of thinking around how we design these sessions, it was clear to us that the railway has been challenged at various points over the last 18 months. Reform has been stalled or delayed. Investment has been questioned, and questioned quite publicly and actively, and at times outputs and outcomes were not at the level that the industry would wish to have achieved. And this has happened in a very public and very politically charged way. So we reflected that there were really three themes that needed to be explored to try and unpack that kaleidoscope of issues. And the three themes that we wish to sort of explore through these sessions were: what is the relevance of Britain's railways to public policy goals and to the everyday lives of the public, the non-travelling public, and the many enterprises and actors in the economy that depend on or participate in the railway? We want to explore how the railway can be more effective in demonstrably delivering to those goals, to those stakeholders, to those employees and its participants. And importantly, we want to consider how we can make an impact and improvement immediately, not be delayed or deferred in taking action through a period of prolonged consideration, but identify the opportunities for real, tangible, but immediate improvement. And that, for me, talks to understanding, discussing how the railway can evolve and change, how it can demonstrate relevance to those strategic challenges, and how it can grow confidence amongst its users, funders, investors and regulators. And I think it's really important for an industry that's gone through periods of intense focus on change that we recognise we live in a very dynamic world, and whatever structures, whatever changes, whatever initiatives are put into place to benefit the railway, that the ability to change in the future is also retained. So we've had three sessions that have dug deep into those issues, and today is the third and final session. Perhaps it's the headline act, we could say. We had an excellent session earlier in Birmingham where we really talked in some depth about how the railway contributes towards growth and productivity. A session in Manchester that was not long after the HS2 and Network North announcement that focused on the impact of railways within the function of a community. And today we talk about something that is really of huge importance. How do we secure revenue growth through serving our passengers? And the panel that we have to talk to this issue, I will introduce to you in a moment or two. So, the panel. Today's format sees 3 presentations from Mark, Suzanne and Jeff, and then we will invite Helen and David to respond to what they've heard, perhaps adding some of their own flavour and perspectives. We'll then have a Q&A session. If you see me fidgeting on my phone during the Q&A session, I'm not on socials. That is the mechanism by which colleagues and participants online can share with us their questions and perspectives. So let me introduce to you the panel, and I think there is one characteristic of this panel that we should reflect on and acknowledge. These are individuals that have day in, day out accountability for the delivery of service, the management of revenue, as well as looking forward and charting a course through some of that uncertainty that I've described. So I think to hear from people that are so genuinely engaged on these issues gives us a really powerful start to today's session, and thank you to all of our panellists, both today and at our prior sessions, for participating. So let me introduce to you today's panellists. We're joined by Mark Hopwood, CBE. Mark has had a distinguished and long-standing career in the rail industry, since starting at Reading Station in 1989, working for a range of TOCs and also British Rail. Mark is currently Managing Director at First Great Western, a post that is held since 2008, albeit with a period working at sister company, the South Western Railway. Mark's initial focus was to restore punctuality, reliability, and then subsequently work with government to build the case to add additional capacity to address the then capacity shortages on the routes. More recently, Mark and his team have played a leading role in the introduction of new electric trains, the Crossrail project, and the rebuilding of key stations, including Reading. Building on Mark's extensive experience in the rail industry is his range of strategic roles, which includes chairing the UK Rail Industry National Task Force and sitting on the Rail Delivery Group Planning and Production Board. Welcome, Mark, and thank you. Joining us also on the panel is Jeff Hobbs from Transport for London. Jeff is Director of Public Transport Service Planning, a role that is all-encompassing, covering the major modes of transportation that exist in London, from the underground through to the buses, through to the overground, DLR and trams. In this leading role that shapes our capital and the public transport service that it enjoys, Jeff is responsible for planning, developing and justifying changes to TfL's services. He also leads TfL's input into the development of the national rail network in London and more widely, working hard with his team to identify and justify the priorities of TfL. Jeff, we're delighted you're joining us today. Thank you. Our third panellist is Susan Donnelly. Susan is currently on secondment to the GBR-TT leadership team, holding a responsibility for passenger revenue and marketing team, which builds upon the work initially completed by the Rail Revenue Recovery Group, set up in early 2021, I suppose in the midpoint of the pandemic. It is obvious to us all, I'm sure, that revenue recovery and growth is critical to the financial sustainability of the railway, both today and in the future. This means that Suzanne has a twin focus: short-term acceleration of demand and revenue, and then also working to ensure that Great British Railways is built, formed and operated in a way that puts customer and revenue management at its heart. Prior to this point, Susan has 16 years of railway experience in a range of commercial roles, including most recently Commercial Director for London North East Railway and 11 prior years in the airline sector. Suzanne, we're delighted you're joining us today to share with us that perspective. I will introduce also Helen Hamlin. Helen is the Chief Network Operator for Network Rail and is responsible for colleagues at a route and regional level to deliver services daily for customers. Within the system operator, Helen and her team provide coordination and leadership ranging from response, weather and day-to-day related activities working through the Network Operating Centre, working both tactically and strategically to deliver improved performance. Helen and team also support the development and assurance of operational management, safety, activities and policies. And prior to joining Network Rail, Helen held a range of roles that included a spell at a transport consultancy called Steer and as production director in a train operating company cross country. Joining Helen in our respondent panel is David Sybottom. David is Transport Focus's director, a post he's held since 2011, having initially started working in that organisation in 2006 as senior stakeholder manager, progressing through the role of bus passenger directory and more recently becoming responsible for the planning and delivery of Transport Focus's duties and stakeholder relations, as well as general advocacy work across the north of England, Wales and Scotland. And prior to working with Transport Focus, David spent 11 years representing the needs of consumers in the north of England, where he was Regional Director of Energy Watch. I think from all of our panellists, we have all bases covered. We have great experience on the delivery of the railway. We have great experience and perspective that is born from the view of the consumer. So before handing on to Mark to deliver the opening presentation, just a brief reminder of today's practicalities. There will be 3 scene-setting presentations, responded to by Helen and David, a panel discussion with Q&A. For the Q&A, I will ask those in the room to please raise their hand. We will bring you a microphone and there will be an opportunity to raise your question. There will also be inbound questions raised via the webinar software. If after today's event you've reflected, have perspective, have thoughts, please do email my colleague Mike Goggin, who is our Managing Director of Growth at Steer, and he will be delighted to hear more. And then there will be an opportunity for around about 30 minutes or so from 10:30 for informal networking. So I'm going to vacate the lectern and hand over to Mark.
Thank you very much, Hugh, and good morning to everyone here and those of you online. It's great to be here, great to have this opportunity to talk a little bit about Great Western Railway and where we are with some of the challenges that you've heard about in that sort of scene setting there. And I think I wanted to start off by just saying, we've recognised over the last sort of 2 or 3 years, and I think recognise there's still more work to be done, that there is an opportunity for the railway industry to have a look at what you might call a strategic reset. But GWR rebranded back in 2015, and we sought to have a look really at what our customers thought about us, to have a brand that actually recognised the heritage of the business, but also recognised that Brunel, as he founded the railway, was seen as someone who was very much looking to the future, that a man who was ahead of his time. And I think in recognising what Brunel was doing, we were trying to perpetuate that sense of looking forward rather than perhaps looking back to the time that Brunel was around himself. And I think our people in the business, everyone who works in GWR is very proud of that heritage. But as we go out and about around our region, we find lots of stakeholders, customers, local businesses, all sorts of people who share that excitement and that enthusiasm as well. So Brunel very much in the blood of what we're doing, and also recognising that there's a very powerful legacy of the Great Western Railway leading the way in terms of marketing, not just its railway services, but also marketing the whole region that we serve as well. So clearly we've spent quite a bit of time recently being in reactionary mode. We're very keen to move into a more visionary era. And I think looking at what our brand in Great Western Railway can bring, it's quite interesting actually, as I got here relatively early this morning. I've already had 2 conversations with people in the room who've come up to tell me how great the people on Great Western are. I don't know if people are just trying to endear themselves to me, but it is great to have a team that encourages that type of feedback. We obviously want to be customer focused. We want to think beyond the product that is just the train itself. It's great that we've got things like the sleeper product, the Pullman dining product, first class on many of our trains. But one of the great strengths on Great Western is actually the destinations that we serve. And I always have to be careful making this remark, but I will make it. I mean, I loved my time running C2C out of Fenchurch Street, and it was a great job, and there's aspects of that job that I still miss. But it was always a challenge, sat down with my marketing team, talking about how we were going to encourage people to go to East Tilbury and Basildon. And actually, one of the great things about Great Western Railway is the destinations, you know, with the Cotswolds, Oxford, Bath, Devon and Cornwall, and of course, you know, the attraction the other way of London as well. So we think that's a compelling story and one that we want to build on. And many of you have seen a graph similar to this before, but it's just in the context of Great Western. The 7 days of the week, light blue back in 1920, dark blue roughly where we are today. And of course you can see the fall in weekday business, but a bit of an explosion on Saturday. Sunday's a small rise, but of course it's important to recognise the changes we've seen, but not get too carried away. You know, some people are saying, oh, well, we should close the railway on a Monday and Tuesday and have no engineering work on a Sunday. Well, that's not actually what that graph tells you is the way forward. And of course, our friends in the freight industry have a strong view on that as well. So, but you can see some real change. And Friday's really interesting, because many of you, I suspect, may work occasionally at home on a Friday, and many of our customers do. But of course, you get that explosion of leisure business later in the day. And leisure business on GWR is 60% of our journeys now. Service delivery, of course, really important. Very difficult times for the industry with industrial action from RMT and ASLEF, and that continues, sadly, and is a challenge for us. But I think, while I would like to have much stronger customer satisfaction, I think the fact that we've managed to generally hold customer satisfaction in what's been a pretty torrid period, I think is a reasonable achievement. And we've put enormous effort in Great Western to keeping a train service running. Every strike day we've run services. Some routes, even on an ASLEF strike day, have got an hourly service. We've been running hourly from London to Bristol, London to Oxford. Other services are running. I've got over 100 driver managers out driving trains on ASLEF strike days. And I think our customers value that, and it's important that we keep that going. So in very simplistic terms, and of course it's not a simple subject, but our approach around revenue is to protect the revenue that we ought to be collecting anyway, to think very carefully about the timetable. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're running a railway company, the timetable's your product, and that's something that we really need to think carefully about, and particularly moving perhaps to more of a differentiated timetable. We're starting this December to make 1 or 2 experimental changes with some slightly different outputs on a Monday compared to perhaps a Tuesday to a Friday. Thinking carefully about how we retail as Great Western, but how we work with other people like Trainline who retail our product as well. Also thinking quite carefully about yield. And of course, I mean, many of you online and in the room very much aware that actually the challenge for the industry isn't just about passenger numbers, it's also about yield. And we've seen some challenges around the actual passenger numbers, but probably a bigger challenge around yield. And some of those are things that were going on, quite frankly, prior to COVID. You know, people looking for better value deals, the emergence of split ticketing, much less discipline around commuters and business travellers, less of an obsession around having to be in the office for 9 o'clock. People quite comfortable with the idea they can be a commuter and travel off-peak. And I think actually this whole peak and off-peak thing, I mean, anyone who knows much about my business, I mean, the whole peak and off-peak definitions are in a complete mess. I mean, I've got huge numbers of trains that run in the so-called peak that have got loads of empty seats on. And I travelled on one this morning with a table of 4 in first class to myself, and I've got a whole long list of off-peak trains on a Sunday afternoon, on a Friday at night time, which according to the definition are off-peak, but they'll be full and standing, and we clearly need to address that as an industry, and having a fare structure that's fossilised as it was in 1993 really doesn't help. So yield's important, and then marketing, some great opportunities there, and our approach to marketing is, not particularly revolutionary, but I think it's important just to say, we want to obviously appeal across the network. We want to use our brand, but also talk about our destinations, which I think is really important, particularly when you've got great destinations, but also push some of the value for money messages that perhaps get lost in some of the media noise. And we've been working, as many of you know, with the Famous Five concept that has worked well for us, but we're also pushing our messaging to new audiences. And I mean, it's great to see Howard Smith here from TfL, but we've been really keen to exploit the benefits of the Elizabeth line. It's not our product, it's a TfL product, but it makes travelling to Paddington significantly more attractive for customers in my region. And it also opens up Great Western Railway to a whole load of people in sort of Kent, South East London, East London and Essex, who perhaps traditionally saw getting to Paddington as just too much hassle, and now it's a proposition they can contemplate with ease, and we're seeing real benefits from that. And day trip opportunities, as well as things like weekends away, is stuff that we're working hard on. So that's an overview from me. I think it is a very difficult time to be in the industry, but it is one with opportunities, some excitement. I think the separation of costs and revenue for train operators brings challenges that make it more difficult for us to work in the current environment. But we are getting on and growing our passenger numbers and growing our revenue. We've introduced some new train services to a limited extent, reopened a railway to Oakhampton, which is delivering double the number of passengers we expected. So there is some good news amongst some of the more challenging messages. I guess the question is, how can we do more and how do we do it more quickly? So that's my introduction, and I look forward to talking to some of you in the question session later on. Thank you.
Mark, thank you. I think such a contemporary exploration of the issues facing train operating companies, and in particular Great Western. Thank you. Particularly struck by the point you made around the entrepreneurial spirit being hardwired into your organisation, and I think your phrase "beyond the train" is a really powerful one that we should perhaps all take away. So moving on to our next speaker and panellist, Susan Donnelly, Revenue Programme Director at GBRTT. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh and Steer, for the opportunity to present today, and good morning, everyone. So, as we stand here today, we are still suffering from the effects and the consequences that were flagged in the white paper of today's fragmented railway structure. But we've also had a couple of years of learning. We've learned about post-pandemic demand patterns and all sorts of things, so I'll just touch on some of that. So today, overall, GB Rail revenue levels are up over 90% of pre-pandemic levels. But once we adjust for the Elizabeth line, which clearly wasn't in the base, and also inflation, that's closer to 75%. And that's partly the reason why we continue to have a subsidy line of close to 4 billion. But when you look at the individual journey purpose travel trends, you can see that leisure travel, very much as Mark just outlined, has absolutely been leading the way in terms of the recovery profile. Business has been lagging behind, about 50%, and commuting travel also lagging, but encouragingly this year has started to pick up a bit as people have been travelling more frequently. But we've also seen new patterns emerge by time of day and day of week. Again, I'll touch on some of this. We've seen Saturdays and Sundays particularly very strong. But also, unfortunately, the key metrics of customer satisfaction, advocacy, In fact, every measure of customer that you can think of has taken a downhill turn this year on the back of uncertainty and industrial action. However, I think what we've seen is the fundamentals of what our current passengers want and what prospective passengers want hasn't fundamentally changed. And we've got a massive opportunity for modal shift. So I'll come on to that shortly. So we clearly have got a major financial challenge in our hands. That's not gone away. But it's not, this opportunity for modal shift isn't just about the financials. It's also about powering that economic, social, and environmental benefit, a lot of which we've heard about in the previous two events in this series. So our argument, and we're trying to kind of win this argument, is that we need to come together much more as an industry to really go for growth, to really, really go for growth. And of course, today, train operators are on NRCs and contracts that were put in as a short-term fix post-pandemic, which work brilliantly, but they're not fit for purpose going forward. And they do need to be evolved and get TOCs back to really doing what they're best at, which is going for commercial growth. But contracts alone won't be enough to kind of unleash that growth. Britain's railways still continue to have a structural problem. Many of you will know URT3 was set up in late 2021 to bring to life some of the early reforms and start to put in place some of the whole system or guiding mind capabilities that previously didn't exist. And our purpose is to create a simpler, better railway for everyone in Britain. And it's been quite a journey. We spent the last couple of years bringing together a team, getting together lots of talent, but we've had a pretty turbulent economic backdrop. And we've had what can only be described as a roller coaster of a political backdrop. But nevertheless, I think it's worth just reminding ourselves, and you'll have heard Andrew talk about this at the previous event, or my colleagues talk about it a lot. We've got this fundamental problem about fragmentation. And train and track managed separately, revenue and cost accountability separated in government, different and misaligned incentives. These are not the recipe for success. And decisions simply aren't being taken in that whole system way. And when I mean whole system, I mean bringing together revenue, cost, train, passenger operators, freight operations and infrastructure all together. But I just want to be clear that that's not the fault of any one organisation. Everybody's obviously acted in their own against the incentives that they had. But that's really where whole system thinking comes in. And I know that you'll be frustrated about the pace of change. We all are. We all share that frustration. And hopefully on the 7th of November, the King's speech will at least give us clarity on whether legislation will take place. But regardless of the outcome on that day, rail reform does remain a government priority. But I think what we can't afford to do, and what we absolutely mustn't do, and I'm sure many of you share this spirit, is we mustn't sit back and wait for legislation or structural reform. There is loads that we can and are indeed getting on with in the here and now. And just to give you a flavour of some of the activity that GBRTT has been working on with train operators and RDG and others over the last year or two, things like the Great British Rail Sale, a whole series of marketing campaigns to promote brand rail. More recently, Green Travel Pledge to promote the carbon advantages of rail. And currently working on future initiatives to simplify fares and retail. But what I wanted to just take a minute or two was to focus on some of the work that we're doing to develop whole system tools and capabilities. We're in quite a good position to be able to kind of collate and analyse data nationally for Britain. Obviously, TOCs do this in their own territories, but to look at it from a big picture point of view and enable decision makers right from Network Rail to TOCs to DFT to Treasury to see that bigger picture of what's going on. So we've created lots of reports that really dive into what's happening from a passenger and revenue perspective. And we've also created a model for forecast rail revenues and also econometrics model to measure the impact of cross-cutting activity. such as the National Marketing Campaign or national customer interventions. And all of these models and activities are helping us in making key industry decisions. So one example of that is the March annual fares rise decision. So for the March 23 decision, we did a lot of work to use a lot of these models and information analysis to help support the department in making a recommendation to government as to what that should be, and indeed then to evaluating the impact of that this year. And more recently, we've also created a series of industry finance tools which, look at the whole network and say, right, okay, well, what does, in any particular given segment or geography, what does it look like? What are the revenues? What are the costs? What's the performance? What does it look like in the round? And that's proving very helpful in terms of CP7 planning from a market perspective. And it's just astonishing, I think, that, it's been over 20 years since the industry's had this kind of just drawing back the curtain on what is the total picture, rather than looking at any, one part of it in isolation. Oh, one second. So let's move on to the opportunity. I think all of you are pretty aware of rail's market share is low. If you exclude walking, it's 4.5%. Primarily versus road and a little bit of air. But there is plenty of capacity, more or less, across the country to accommodate a shift. And we did commission a piece of work earlier this year to look at what we call the headroom opportunity. And by headroom, I mean the number of trips that are being taken across the country that people would have considered travelling by rail, but ultimately rejected it. And this research told us not only the reasons that they were rejecting it, but able to put a value on that. And that has kind of illuminated the fact that, if we can tackle these key barriers, there is, over 370 million annual journeys out there for grabs. That's equivalent of over £2 billion in revenue, gross revenue. And when I say we, I really mean the Royal Industry we. This is Network Rail, this is TOCS, this is GBRTT, RDG. This is all players coming together. Everybody's got a role to play. It's not just one player. So we kind of took this analysis, we mapped customer segmentation across the country and market sectors, and worked very closely with operators to build effectively a commercial plan. And what we call the PROP, so the Passenger Revenue Optimisation Plan. And this is a commercial plan for the next 3 years, which sets out a framework for driving net sustainable revenue growth. So prioritise where are the things that we should be focusing on as an industry. We've got a limited amount of money, we've got a limited amount of time and resource, where should we focus our energy? And it sets out that framework. And these are the 5 key themes on the screen, which I probably don't have time to run through, but it gives you an idea of the areas that we're focusing on. So optimising how capacity is used, bringing consistency where it's relevant to the customer proposition, addressing performance, making real comfort better value for money, and particularly through the FTR programme, and improving communications, both how we promote the railway and how we inform our customers. So I think the case for rail is definitely stronger than it was 2 years ago. But the risk is that we look to other people to shape our destiny. And bringing that track and train together does remain that ultimate prize, but we can't just wait. And we can't afford to wait for legislation. Let's get on with it. And our challenge is to continue to make that case and continue to make the case for the broader environmental, economic and social benefit of the railway. And also recognise that there's all sorts of people doing all sorts of great things across the country, in spite of the structures and the cultures and the challenges that we've got today. But I do firmly believe that we can use our collective clout as an industry, and that is greater than the sum of its parts. Thank you very much.
Suzanne, thank you. A very powerful case made there, I think, for the benefits that rail can deliver in terms of securing additional mode share, delivering financial sustainability to the industry, but also, I think, quite significant decarbonisation and wider environmental benefits, all underpinned by that need to come together. Thank you. Our next speaker is Jeff Hobbs, Director of Service Planning at Transport for London. Jeff.
Morning, everyone. Very good to see you all here and indeed online. I'm going to test your patience and your eyesight with this infographic here. Now, you'll find that a lot of what I say I share with my two previous speakers in terms of the content. A happy but not unexpected coincidence. So this graphic shows you all sorts of things. It's for the London Underground. I've taken an illustrative of one of our 6 business areas. We have across the top different times of day, 7 different times of day chunked up into 3-hour periods. We've got the day of the week going down the side from Monday through to Sunday. And you'll see many of the themes that have become familiar over the last few years. The data is taken from July of this year, but it hasn't changed an awful lot. Overall, for the Underground, it's 87% of what it used to be in the old days, 2019. But you see some very distinct patterns there. Like Mark, I don't think that, or rather I think the death of the morning peak has been overstated. It's still the busiest time of day. Actually, not quite. What that diagram says is the busiest time of day is Thursday evening peak. Morning peak is still very busy. The exceptions to that are Monday and Friday, where you're down at 600,000 trips in the case of Friday. Now that is still, of those 49 boxes on this busy infographic, the 12th busiest of that 49. So it's still a very significant time. And we have in this, in terms of the Underground, the advantage of, unlike parts of National Rail, of keeping pretty much the same level of scheduled service as we did in the old days. Some reductions in some places, some enhancements in others for that matter, but pretty much the same schedule as we had before. You'll see a few other themes. I mentioned the fact that evening peaks particularly busy. It's a matter of conventional wisdom that Saturdays, and to a slightly lesser extent Sundays, have recovered extremely well, and you'll see that in that graphic there. For those of you that are night owls, you'll see that we're above pre-COVID levels for the very large majority of late night trips after 10 o'clock at night. So many themes there, also not shown on this graphic. But also it's true to say that outer London public transport has recovered to a much greater extent than central London in large part. And once you get into the reasons for all this, you can say that working from work has recovered, so has education, those sorts of trips. Leisure has recovered well, but of course the classic commuting trip, the 9 to 5, there is more discretion, there is more choice. Now, that is both a strength and a weakness insofar as there being more choice. One wakes up, one can look at the weather, one can look at the status updates and make a decision on whether one wants to come into work or not. But part of that is about the quality of service, both in terms of the train service, but more generally the customer experience, and make a decision based on that. So what we do as rail operators matters just that little bit more. So a few factors here in terms of how customers' expectations are obvious and becoming and changing to a degree. Some factors here which will all be tremendously familiar to an awful lot of you, I'm sure. And of course, it's a matter of well-researched convention that population and employment and tourism and income, things like that are all very impactful upon the level of demand. More closer to home, of course, you've got fares, service levels, which I've mentioned already. We have the advantage in TfL of having managed to keep, as I say, much of our service. The Underground is running about sort of 98% schedule of what we were in 2019. Buses slightly less, about 97. And of course, we've also had some advantage from cost of competitors with deliveries and taxis and minicabs tending to go up somewhat. But journey time matters as much as it ever did. And that's a piece of research looking at the post-pandemic behaviours, trying to make sure that journey times are minimised, that performance still matters more than ever for some of the reasons I mentioned, and getting that right, there's a return to the focus of that within TfL certainly. I also mentioned that people look also at the quality of service. One aspect of that is around crowding, and there's a degree less of that because the peaks are less peaked than they used to be. But we've done research in the very recent past, in the last 6 months, looking at how crowding affects customer behaviours. The outcome of that, we have the great advantage of having immensely detailed individual trip data, and we can also look at the journey times that they have, individual trips make. And it gives a data set of millions and millions of data. In the old days when I was growing up, if you had a clipboard of 100 pieces of data, you considered yourself lucky. But these days you have millions, literally millions. The outcome of that is to show that crowding does indeed matter slightly more than it used to. We've written it up in a paper full of long words in one of these august academic publications that, which I'll put the link at the bottom there. But other than that, there's an awful lot that remains the same. The more it changes, the more similarities there remain. We have the same basic factors going on. Journey time matters. Now, I am Mr. Journey Time within Transport for London, so it's no wonder that I say that. But it remains the case that all our research, bang up to date as it is, shows that. So, and in particular, we've gone back to revisit to see whether that relationship has changed materially, and it hasn't. So for every 6% change in journey times, if you have a worsenement in journey times, then you get a 10% reduction in usage. And that's not wholly different from how it's been from time immemorial. And away from railways, that's one of the reasons why we've started to think about more express buses and the Superloop brand that we started to talk about in Transport for London. But back to the day job, as it were, and that means that there's a great deal of focus, as I mentioned, on performance and making sure that we run what we're saying we're going to run, which isn't always, I find, even from personal experience, necessarily the case. Naturally enough, the quality of customer experience matters. And so do all the economic and development factors, as they always have. Note, however, that fares has a rather lesser impact. So you increase fares by 3% and usage goes down by 10%. At the moment, of course, fares are changing less than the rate of inflation, so real fares are going down, if anything, slightly. And then, of course, there are all the factors around the quality of customer information, listed a few down there. So support when things go wrong, the empathy that customers require, especially those who are less frequent with the network than people like me, who like nothing better than to wander around at various times a day. Progress and innovation, trying to make that apparent to customers, making it easy to use. The open and honest communication to feel welcome and included. And of course, you've got all the environmental benefits of all. But an understated element of this, Suzanne mentioned it, is simplicity. There's an awful lot about public transport that really isn't simple. There's a lot of tacit knowledge required, and people like me, we like looking at schedules and fare tariffs on a Sunday afternoon, but most people do not. And making it simple matters immensely, really does. And to make it easier, to reduce those barriers to entry, be it fares, be it ticketing, be it the service levels, be it anything else. So a few of the things we've been trying to do to get recovery accelerated as much as we ever possibly can. I've got some examples on screen there of some of our advertising material. Already been mentioned today, but we have the immense advantage of something extremely new and exciting and a huge change, and that's the Elizabeth line. Very good to see Howard, my colleague here, who can vouch for the excitement that it has generated, both in terms of his personal life and indeed for customers. So we've been making the most of that. It is a lot quicker to travel on. About the average customer takes 20% less time. No surprise, therefore, that when we look at where the customers come from on the Elizabeth line, yes, some of them have transferred from existing underground trips or Docklands Light Railway or National Rail, but quite a lot we can't find from there, and we think have come from other sources. No surprise. We should expect that degree of generation. People choose to come into the West End slightly more frequently than they would have done before, rather than go to godforsaken places like Lakeside, because the Elizabeth line is a better product. It is faster. You don't have to interchange. It is simpler. Journey time matters, to repeat myself again. And there are a few other things up there which I mentioned. Elizabeth line campaign, but also the value that public transport gives. So the level of fares, it's a perception gap. Given even the relative complexity of the TfL tariff, that fares are often higher than they really are. One of the small number of things which is relatively simple about the bus network is the fare is a flat one. It's 175. Go as far as you like within the hour. And we want to make the most of that sort of message. We also work with various other London partners, Science Museum, Kew Gardens, and also with the press, Metro and Time Out, to try and bring up those leisure trips in order to substitute for those trips where people choose to work from home, as they empirically are. So there's an awful lot of activity to try and get those trip numbers up, and we're beginning to see that happening. You can see it in the patterns in my busy infographic at the beginning, where you see those leisure times of day in particular, and leisure days of the week, the ones which have recovered fastest. So I hope that gives a small exposition of the sorts of things in which we're, the patterns that we're observing and how we're trying to react to it. Thank you very much for listening.
Jeff, thank you. A wonderful infographic and a wonderful journey, I think, through the work that you and colleagues at TfL are doing to understand the drivers of demand and the customer perceptions in the current market and how that's being turned into action. And so thank you for sharing that with us. So just a little bit of a reminder about what happens next and what the expectation is of you, our audience. In a moment or two, I'm going to ask Helen Hamlin and then David Sidebottom to provide their responses to the content that you've heard so far this morning. And then we'll have a Q&A session. Questions can be posed from the floor and also online, and we'll wrap up around about 10:30. But if I could first invite Helen Hamlin to give to us all, to share with us all, her response to what's been heard.
Thank you. So, hello colleagues in the room, hello colleagues online. I'm going to start by just making an observation. So my background is mainly in railway ops, and you might think, well, what the hell has that got to do with revenue? But I think as we've heard this morning, the ability to provide a service that our customers want and rely on is absolutely key to supporting that revenue line. I think that's both for passengers and freight, and certainly speaking from the Network Rail point of view, we must be able to deliver to be creditable. I'm going to talk a bit about the balance of short-term and long-term change, which has come up in a number of discussions this morning. We heard very clearly about the roller coaster, and in preparing for what I might say this morning, I went back and looked through what had happened in rail privatisation since about the mid-90s. And indeed before that, and it's quite evident that we've been on a roller coaster for some considerable time, although perhaps now we're either going up or downhill a little bit more sharply than we were before. And in making that observation, I would just challenge that perhaps we're in a situation at the moment where we don't have DfT, Treasury and civil servants aligned behind the change agenda. And actually, in some of the conversations we're having with the department and with civil servants, it's evident at the moment they don't really get the need for change, and perhaps more controversially, don't really understand how to make that change. So I would contend we are stuck. We are having conversations quite clearly with potential future administrations, and I think certainly I think we are in a limbo state until some of that comes through. So that gives us a situation where we need to deliver something in the short term without legislation. And I think for me that needs a combination of energy, leadership, and some ability to cut through the treacle. And I mean by treacle those things that stop us moving, and there are loads of them. Suzanne identified NRCs, and I would add to that the ABP process with the departments. I can see Chris over there thinking, goodness, we're trying to engage with that, and there are definitely some challenges. Moving back to performance, we talked a little bit this morning earlier about performance collaboration, and there is much to do in that space. That's third, fourth. Industrial action. I think we're a little bit stuck in that place. It's difficult to see a resolution to that, I think, maybe until after an election, but maybe that matters less at the moment, but because of the way the market is, but actually, you know, it's sapping a great deal of time and a great deal of energy. And when you look at the impact of action short of a strike, actually that's affecting us at really peak times and really important times for our customers. So first trains off in the morning, later trains in the evening when we might be travelling for leisure, and certainly over the weekend. So I think that's really going to revenue at the moment. So in terms of what else we can change in the short term, I can see some effort going into updating that base plan and managing change better, particularly things like East Coast for DEC 24, and really looking at when we've got engineering access. That's never a good balance, but really trying to hone where that happens around some of our peaks. And the final thing I'd say about short-term collaboration, and this isn't probably something that is top of everybody's agenda, although Jeff, you mentioned weather. And I think one of the things that's been evident to me in the few months I've been doing the job is just what an impact that is having on us. And actually how as an industry we've probably rightly overreacted to what is happening, and we need to just wheel that back slightly. Because I think our response to wet weather, high winds and some of those other things is massively risk averse and we just need to rephase that. And there are some things that we should do collaboratively with operators in that space. So just to wrap up, how do we get to whole system thinking? Actually, that's going to need real leadership, and it's going to need us to change our thoughts from can't do, how can we do it, to actually how can we deliver this. So who's going to lead that? Well, actually I would contend that's all of us. That's not just one person, that is all of us. I'm going to leave it at that point.
Helen, thank you. Strong views covering a multitude of issues. Thank you. And our sort of final respondent is David Sidebottom of Transport Focus. David.
Thank you to Steer for asking Transport Focus to say a few words. Appreciate that, and welcome to people in the room and online. I'll keep it brief to allow as much time as possible for questions and debate. I think what really impressed me from the presentation so far is the notes I scribbled down beforehand have all been largely covered by everybody, so I'm not going to go over too much old ground, but it would be remiss of me not to go over something I've said many times at podiums over the years, is that relentless focus on performance and reliability. Jeff referred to it, whether it's rail, bus or coach. I think exactly what people buy their fare and ticket for is delivery of the timetable. There have clearly been challenges over the years. I won't go over the ground why that is, but I think there are little case studies around, and as a northerner in the room, I just look at the Transpennine Route Upgrade programme, a lot of really good investment. We're working very hard with Network Rail and the TOCs to understand how that disruption is best managed. But equally, we're seeing some modal shift there. We know that National Express, and it might be in the margins in railway terms, but National Express are nicking some railway passengers. Growth in coach services from Manchester to Leeds to Newcastle. So I think there's little warning signs there about how we better manage disruption, better manage information when there are delays as well, and people's trust in the system. Mark alluded to it there with sort of getting hold of the comms agenda again and the branding and the marketing. You need to ally that with a very good service, and past work we've done at Transport Focus has shown that people's trust in the railway, the foundation of all that is about reliability and performance, and then you need to excel and make sure you deliver that service that you promise, but also the marketing, the branding and the fares sort of come next. And owning that agenda, there's a lot of negativity around rail, and certainly in past years around performance, and I think it's important that the railway takes hold of that. And just one thing about, as Suzanne mentioned, it's about modal shift. I do quite a lot of work with the mayoral combined authorities in the north, on buses particularly, and what's happening in Manchester as a Mancunian is really interesting to see, with buses coming into the fold. And that actually, where does rail play its part in that? And I think the Trailblazer deals that have been announced for West Midlands and for Greater Manchester will give opportunities. I think looking forward, looking to tomorrow's railway, is how in those big city regions, because I think the politics are all going in one way, devolution and levelling up, whether it's this government, the next government, whether that's red or blue in colour, devolution and levelling up will play a continued part. What rail can do in there to make it easier, going back to previous points really about making the fare system, the ability to travel into Manchester and just tap and forget like we do in London is going to be huge, and I think how that joins in with tram and buses locally. And I think just a small example of that would be, going back to buses again, I'm feeling quite brave in a room full of rail people, the £2 cap fare, whatever the economics of it all, it has attracted people who have not been on the bus for 30 years to get on the bus, my wife being an example, and she loved it. It was cheap, it was convenient, and it took away that fear factor of how on earth do I ask for the right fare and that sweaty palm moment when the bus turns up. I think that there are good examples in there, and I know, again, as a northern customer, lots of good stuff with their northern flash sales that they've had, attracting additional revenue and additional trips and getting people, like Mark's busy off-peak trains, people who use the train for the first time in a long time to go into town or to do what they need to do. So I think there are great opportunities there. But again, going back to the base, the best advert for the railway and modal shift, or for any form of public transport, is make the things run on time. Easier said than done, I know, but it's really important. Thank you.
David, thank you. Very powerful and clear response to what's been shared. So I'm going to invite to join me here on the stage, if you would kindly pop on up and take a seat. We are at that moment where the body of evidence moves from our panellists to our audience, whether you are online or here in person. It is your opportunity to pose questions, thoughts and perspective to this group on the basis of what you've heard. With 5 panellists and no doubt many questions, we could probably find we only cover 2 or 3 questions if all 5 panellists were to answer each question. So I'll be asking just a selection of the panellists to address each question. If there is a particular panellist you would like to address your question because it relates to their content, then please do let me know in the formation of your question. And I'm going to start with an online question, if that is okay, to those in the room. And it's a question that is aimed initially at Mark. And the question is, Mark, you spoke about the rebrand to GWR, and there is clearly power in identity, but do you think the double arrows, or indeed a common brand across Intercity, would simplify and remove complexity for the potential passenger? Mark, I wonder if you would have a view on that point.
I mean, it's a really complex subject. I guess the interesting thing in my business is we've brought the regional and the local trains together with the Intercity trains, and that's brought some big benefits, both in terms of how we operate the network, but more importantly for our customers. I struggle to see how you can have it both ways. You know, you can't probably have an Intercity network across the UK with one brand and then have a a regional railway, and I guess we'll have to think about what's more important. And you've also got to do that in the context, I think, of devolution. And one of the things that disturbs me a little bit on the railway at the moment is there seems to be an increasing trend towards centralisation in a world where everybody's talking about devolution. So we have to get that right as well. And you could sit here all day and argue both sides of the equation. It is quite complex, and there's strong arguments, I think, in both regards.
Thank you, Mark. Suzanne, I wonder if you perhaps like to comment on that question, given the thrust of your presentation.
Yeah. So I think if you look at it from a customer perspective, it is horribly complex today. You know, we've got individual rail brands. Great Western stands out like a beacon, but it nevertheless is complex. There's lots of people saying broadly the same in broadly similar ways, and lots of different products, and all sorts of things that are quite confusing, particularly for new people or the people that we're trying to attract to the railway. So I do think there is, and it is different, I don't disagree with Mark, but I do think there is a strong case for having a more unifying brand to bring rail together and present rail more simply to the travelling public.
Thank you. And now let's turn to the room for the first of our in-person questions. There's a question at the back. Dick Dunmore.
Dick Dunmore. Very, very briefly, my question is policy on fares, but to elaborate slightly, we appraise rail infrastructure and services on the assumption that fares will stay broadly the same. The franchising model, and if I understand Suzanne correctly, is mainly about profit maximisation. She didn't use those words, but it seems to be about delivering as much money as possible rather than as many benefits. Mark says he's trying to do so with a fare structure fossilised in the 1993. Jeff does have the benefit of there with a clear fares policy, knows his price elasticities and focus on simplicity, as does David. And I know that in Scotland, or I think I know, they've actually abolished peak fares as an experiment. So the question is, do we have a coherent policy on fares? And in particular, are we using fares as a policy lever to buy social, economic, environmental benefits, and are we losing sight of that with the immediate focus on revenue?
Dick, thank you. An extensive question and reprisal of differing policies and operationalisation of those. I think the question is, are we using the tools at our disposal properly? And I'm going to ask David to initially cover that question, and then I'll move to Jeff.
Great question, which is me stalling to think of a great answer. I can't give you a coherent answer on the kind of coherent policy across rail or the modes. I think one thing we've seen, what I would say, and the first time I'm going to mention this, is the ticket office proposal stuff, with all the lots and lots of comments we've had from members of the public and organisations, that there are a number of issues coming through that, everything from passenger assistance, retailing, and the ticket, the fare structure, as Mark alluded to. Having that in a place now which is simpler for people to understand would take away quite a few concerns from people. And I know we've wrestled with this for many years. I think I stood in one of these meeting rooms back in 2009-10 and talked about simplification of fares, and I think it's difficult, really, really difficult to do. But I go back to, again, just thinking about the devolution point as well, is in those big city regions, people are looking increasingly to the debate that's been started by the mayors around, the London-style network. I wish I had £1 for every time it's been mentioned. It is happening, and I think, whether that's national or regional, that ability to make fares look and feel like something that I can use to do my journeys in my region is hugely important.
Yeah, well, the confusion around is partly a function of the fact that the fares policy has to do so many different things, of which financial sustainability is one. Just as an aside, I'd really like a trailblazer style Birmingham-Manchester funding deal for London. It'll make life a whole lot simpler. One can plot a fair policy that's with greater ease under those circumstances, because then you would have some stability around the finances. Anyway, no chance of that in the meantime. There are all sorts of other equality things, and we try and work our way through that through the set of concessions which there are multiple, and that helps block away through the tricksiness of fares policy. But the downside of that, of course, that adds to complexity. And I, for one, am a big fan of the different aspects of that favourite word, buzzword at the moment, of simplicity. Now, again, one can try and solve that through ticketing products, which are easy to use, such that you don't, like me, have to spend hours trawling for a fares tariff. But you're always making these trade-offs. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, because I think it might be an impossible question to answer. But nonetheless, that's the way in which, in practice, one inches one's way through to coming up with whatever the fares tariff will be next March.
Thank you. Two great answers. I'm going to return to the online questions before coming back to the room. And it's a question that I'm going to direct to David and Helen. David, you spoke about the trend towards devolution is likely to continue. Will strong local networks provide a challenge to wider network coherence or confidence or wider collaboration between regions and also between passengers and freight operations? So David, I wonder if you'd like to...
I would hope it's all three. And I can only talk in the very early days of discussions that are going on in Manchester with rail operators, Network Rail, and the sorts of organisations that you would hope that are in the same room trying to plot through these things. Obviously you've got the department and you've got other national bodies, but I think that ability to make that joined up network is really a big step that London have been doing for many years, and the ability to go from Staley Bridge into Manchester and just tap on, tap off and cap fares and everything else is you know, it's a huge thing. But you need to bring in your business leaders in the city. You need to bring in your academia. You think about the markets and how you roll that message out, I guess. But the planning bit and how it connects in with the national networks that, you know, into city where Avanti play into Manchester as well. People have got to be part of the planning right from the start, otherwise there could be unintended consequences.
Okay, thanks you. So devolution is undoubtedly a good thing, and we can point to lots of examples where it's delivering passenger benefits, and particularly we spoke about Manchester and that multimodal link, and also certainly on the Transpennine corridor with that real integration across stakeholders. I think there's real benefit there. I think the freight picture is much more complex, so particularly planning and knitting together paths for freight, and in terms of that management and that delivery of those freight services is more difficult. It requires a network approach as well as a devolved approach. So I can see the benefit of working with local ports and local providers and growing those flows, but it does need network coordination to ensure that we can deliver some appropriate paths and services.
Thank you. Jeff, are you wanting to come in on that question?
Yes, just to make the point that the two don't have to be inconsistent, and the advantage of local control or greater local control over local rail services is evidential. So I would say some of the following things with respect to London Overground over the course from 2007 to date. Look at the level of customer satisfaction, level of usage. So if you remember the old days, the North London line had 33 million journeys. Last time I looked for the Overground, it was a bit over 200 million. Even for levels of fares evasion, never mind levels of service performance, a theme which I keep going on about, and the integration of those very largely local trips with all the other parts of the transport network. There's only a proportion of the journeys, about a third of the Overground, that stay wholly within the Overground without changing onto the Underground, buses, DLR, trams, all the rest of it. So that is all a win, and it's not to be sniffed at.
Thank you. And now returning to questions here in the room. Gentleman there, thank you.
John Carr, I'm retired but still active in the Association of Transport Coordinating Officers. My question is about whether benchmarking would have a place in the railways. when I used to attend UITP meetings in the Marketing and Product Development Commission, one of the things that impressed me was that the Nordic countries in particular had got performance benchmarking. They used to get all the members of the associations to fill in a questionnaire. They were actually able, as computerization came in, to do it on a daily basis almost. And this was published within the industry, and there was great competition to be at the top or improving your position in the tables. Now, as far as I know, there's only really London in this country, apart from the Busmark organisation that CILT set up, but there's only really TfL doing anything like this at the moment through the international comparison benchmarking that I think Imperial College does. So that's basically my question, and I think perhaps all members of the panel have got a voice on this, particularly TfL and Jocelyn.
John, thank you. I'm very happy to give Paul an opportunity to address the question, which I think is really examining the value of peer group benchmarking and subsequent publication of performance. Perhaps if we just work along from Suzanne through the panel and give perspectives on the value of benchmarking and being very public on one's performance.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, actually. I think there is a lot of value in it, but also not a lot of care required in interpreting what it tells you. You know, just back to our rail passenger festival last week, which was, you know, European rail operators, North America, all over the world. And, you know, we often look at how Great Britain recovering in revenue terms, example versus France and Germany and Spain, etc. But of course, it's never quite like for, you know, that different countries and different environments have very different transport strategies, different ultimate governmental objectives. So there's never quite a direct parallel, but nevertheless, it's just learning. You know, and there's a lot of things that we are indeed learning from. Things like in Germany, initially their €9 offer, now they're €49 offer for travel and so on. So I absolutely think it's worth capturing learnings and information and insights and intelligence and bringing that back into the UK Railway. But I don't disagree with the fact that benchmarks per se and openly publish them does encourage a healthy competitive spirit too. Just everyone ups their game.
So you're right, we're involved in a lot of benchmarking. We've got something called Comet, which is about the 12 biggest metros. There's Iceberg, which is a group of rather smaller railways, but across a range of cities. International bus benchmarking group in the bus world, which is again sort of a group of 20 or so. And they cover all sorts of topics, performance being one, financials being another, safety, environment. We find it immensely useful. There are lots of pitfalls in terms of how you use that data, which is why we've got clever people from Imperial College and the rest to make sure that they're the neutral broker in all this and even out all the very large number of wrinkles that you can have in benchmarking because people collect data in so many different ways. But we learn an awful lot from that. And it's very helpful in all sorts of ways to find out what our strengths and weaknesses are across all those different dimensions. Useful in terms of our liaison with government, making the case for this, that and the other, in our public relations, innumerable different ways by which one can learn from this. So yeah, we're a big advocate of it.
Thanks, Hugh. So I think I'm a broad advocate of benchmarking, and I can point to lots of examples where we're doing that within routes and regions, across fleets, and in different businesses using staff metrics. A lot of those benchmarks aren't public, but they're definitely used to drive change, but more than that, drive focus about where we should be putting our management time. I am going to say something that's probably contentious, not unlike me, I suppose. Some of us in this room were in a meeting yesterday where we heard from one of our regions about 55 different performance reports they produced on, I think it was a weekly basis, it might be a period basis. We can get to the stage quite easily where benchmarking or data collection and data reporting becomes a cottage industry and doesn't drive benefit. And when I talk about treacle, that's exactly what I mean. And there are some of those bits of benchmarking that we have to stop because they are not going to drive benefit. They're just driving generation of numbers. So very good where it drives looking at the right thing, not very good where it's just driving treacle.
I mean, I agree with what Helen's just said and what Helen said at the podium. I think I'd also say, I mean, benchmarking, quite interesting, perhaps people in the industry are a bit more interested in what goes on overseas than some of our customers. I think from our customers' perspective and us as operators, I think, you know, having a level playing field is quite important. I mean, if I delay a customer by 16 minutes, I have to make an announcement about people's entitlement for delay repay. Last time I got on a Ryanair flight, nobody made an announcement about what I was entitled to, or British Airways, and I don't use coaches very often, but I understand they don't do it either. So by all means, you know, have these things in place, but I think we should apply them across all transport modes. And if rail has to publish punctuality, then let's see what people like National Express and Megabus are up to in punctuality terms as well. That would be my view, I think.
Thank you. I think some of that is interesting about the particularly where you get it. I think, you know, Transport Focus through the used to be the National Rail Passenger Survey, though that has ceased, the replacement survey, Touchwood, will be in place from April. So that will give a consistent measure across all rail operators. But I think particularly what drives the choice bit is that when when we buy our car insurance, home insurance, you get all sorts of stuff if you go on the comparison sites that tells you about trust levels and complaint levels and whatever else. If that sort of dashboard of information helped drive some choice, because the railway does achieve some outstanding results in passenger satisfaction, the context bit's usually important. I think being able to compare that across, if I'm choosing to drive, take the coach on a long distance journey, fly or the train, if there's something in there that helps drive that through proper benchmark context, I think that'd be important.
Thank you very much. I think there's a question here in the room.
Thank you, Sharon Hedges, Transport Focus. I'd like to ask something about the role of the services. The more to have compliments about his great staff. We know that passengers like people. I think we also know there's an aging profile of staffing in the rail industry. There's ostensibly a tight labour market, and I think Suzanne was one of people who mentioned actually transport rail particularly hasn't got a particularly great image at the moment. So what I would be interested to hear from the panel is how do you think rail can attract, recruit, retain and train staff to give the excellent passenger service that I think we all want to see happening?
Thank you. I think it's an excellent question. Mark, would you be willing to take the lead on that question, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think in recent times has done quite well actually in attracting people. The recent challenges around the IR agenda and not having pay awards have begun to make it more difficult. I mean, our pay has become less competitive. Our frontline colleagues have not had a pay award since 2019, and we're in an environment where customer service industries are competing for good people. So I think it is a challenging environment. But actually, you know, a lot of people who come to work for us really enjoy the job. They stay for quite a long time. So I think a lot of the basics are right, but we clearly need to get out of some of the current difficulties. And you know, we've recruited quite a lot of people from the airline industry over the last sort of decade who have stayed and enjoy working here. But so those basics are in place, but there's more to do.
And perhaps Helen, would you add a further perspective, please?
Yeah, so certainly looking at the attraction point, I think the image of rail is probably part of it, but I certainly can see us dealing with or being challenged by recruitment in all of the sectors at the moment, whether it be leadership or whether it be signallers and at the grassroots. I'm quite a believer in cross-industry understanding and cross-industry training. At what level you join the industry, really understanding both sides of the track and train interface, and I wouldn't be doing justice if I didn't mention people like Cairo in their role there, and things like 21st Century Ops, and really getting that good basic and good understanding across the piece. I think if you think about retention, valuing people, good leadership, good behaviours actually have a real part to play, as well as the financial remuneration package, and I think sometimes we miss things there.
Thank you, Beth. I'm going to take an online question before returning to the room, and it's a simple question, and I think it's one that the whole panel should be given an opportunity to answer. In simple terms, what can be done to simplify the fares structure here in the UK? And perhaps if I could ask for simple top-of-the-head answers from each member of the panel, we can get into that topic. Suzanne, would you care to give us your opening view?
Simplify the fare structure. There's, one thing. Rationalise the fare structure. There are, I can't remember the stat off the top of my head, but there are something like 80% of our people travelling on 5% of our ticket types in the country, so it's just ridiculous. I think rationalisation is key. I think how we present in retail, it's not just the fare per se, it's how we present in retail, and moves to, for example, pay-as-you-go, help to kind of, almost move it away from a fare conversation to a convenience conversation. Thank you.
So, obviously in London we have the benefit of a long-established fare system with fare zones and contactless ticketing, and the single thing which you could do to make that simpler is to extend it more widely across the boundary. Now, of course, that's happening. I must observe that it's taking some time for it to happen, but Project Oval will bring 53 stations by the end of the year, so I'm led to believe that it can't come soon enough. Every now and again I'm shooed out from my comfortable office to work on a station for which I've got a licence, and it's always the out-boundary tickets which cause the most grief for me on my gate line.
I'm going to say three things. I know I'm only supposed to say one. So I think it needs to be really understandable. I don't quite know how we get to that point, but transparent. I think there are some journeys that absolutely must be cheaper. And certainly when you look across the network, there are still some outstandingly challenging fares out there. And I think the third thing I've written down is accessible. But Suzanne, you pointed in your presentation to a number of people who are concerned about accessing the railway, and I do think there is a fear factor in some areas that we might have bought the wrong ticket or be on the wrong train, and I think we need to address that.
I think I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think in simple terms, I'd chop it in half. I think local journeys, big cities, the approach TfL have taken, that other metropolitan areas have taken, is the way forward, giving people that confidence that they're getting value for money. And I think longer distance journeys, a lot of our competitors have got much simpler ways, as Suzanne says, of presenting fares. I mean, British Airways have the most enormously complex fare structure, but they only present you with one fare on each flight in each class at the time you ask. They don't tell you about the other 462 that are sat in the background. And we delight in showing customers just how complicated our fare structure is every time they do an inquiry. And actually there's lots of people who've already got this under control. But we do need to get the regulation right, because some of the things that look complicated are because of the way it's regulated. And if we're in competition with other people, you have to question whether we need the degree of regulation that we've actually got.
What they said. Yeah, there's I think it's about feeling confident I've got the right ticket. If I made them, I was travelling to Manchester yesterday morning, the guy sat behind me, I think his season card had run out, and he bought it on the train, his single ticket, and he kept saying, no one reminded me my season card was running out. And it's little things like that, getting clobbered. I know it's a tough job of revenue protection, but when I do make a mistake, don't treat me like a criminal. You know, just it's a discretion thing. I get that, but you know, making those sort of fair fares an agenda.
Thank you all. There's a question here in the room on the front row. I'll come there and then to yourself, Simon. Thank you.
Good morning, thank you. I'm Chris Curtis. I'm the Director of the Industry Timetable PMO and Network Performance for Network Rail. So it's a brilliant discussion. We've heard about the need to drive revenue and that the timetable is our product. Journey time is important, performance is important. But all that together, I'm aware of 3 or 4 proposals for timetable change in the next year or so that improve revenue, reduce cost, improve performance, all round great for passengers, but because a tiny minority of passengers will be disadvantaged, they are held up, awaiting a decision from government. How do we unblock this and take control of it ourselves?
That is an excellent question around the winners and losers that always find themselves present in any railway timetable change and the political winds that can blow through. Perhaps I could ask Helen for a perspective on that.
So there's 2 answers to that, I suppose. The long-term one is about changing the network code and doing some of those things that we've talked about around, you know, making it easier to manage through change. What's the short-term answer? Well, I think that's much more difficult, and I think the answer is probably political. So how do we influence DFT? Well, I mean, this goes to the heart of what we do, doesn't it? How do we influence DFT? But ultimately, how do we introduce, I guess, Cabinet Office and Treasury to make those decisions? I don't think either you or I have a magic bullet on that one, do we?
I'm just going to see if there's any other member of the panel that would like to come in on that question. It really is quite a fundamental question. Jeff, I think.
Well, I had the mixed blessing of introducing a whole range of central London bus whisper it quietly reductions, for which we had a tremendous consultation in the summer of 2022 when I became public enemy number 1. And at the end of the day, we undertook some of them and didn't undertake others. So, you know, obviously buses are different from railways, and the politics is somewhat different, both regionally and modally. But nonetheless, it shows that it's possible in those sorts of contexts. I make a virtue of the equality impact assessment, which one is obliged to do with the Public Sector Equality Act anyway, but it gives the scope and it gives you the intellectual ability to say who the losers are, if there are any, and to what degree, because quite often it's more apparent than real. And that it gives you the ability to fend off naysayers to a greater extent. It might not seem like it at the time, and writing them is a tough ask. The data requirements to try and prove some things in a sufficiently compelling way is quite high, but nonetheless, that's a way into it.
I think David has some comments.
Yeah, I was just going to say consultation's an important part, and it'll probably end up with the same conclusion. You're going to have an angry minority that they're losing as the service or frequency reduces. But I think there's probably an example, again, thinking about the devolution bit again. TransPennine Express, what they're doing in the December timetable, taking out part of its fleet and doing what it's doing, but getting that political, with a big P, sign off in the wall on what it's planning to do. Well, that's taken months of pain to get there. So as all your teams are doing the hard yards in the planning, that it feels as though maybe oversimplistic, there's a parallel piece of work going on to warm up the politicians and those that needs to be warmed up. It may end up with the same conclusion, but whether there's a bit more of a consensus when you get there, I don't know. But I think passenger consultation is something we probably could do with a bit more of.
Great topic, and I think Suzanne has perspective.
Yeah, I just think it would be probably remiss of me not to make this point, but I think the short-term answer is really difficult. I think long-term, I think the more broader sector can get the shoulder behind the wheel about convincing new incoming government that a guiding mind is a good and right answer to help overcome exactly these kind of issues that we've got today.
I think we have a question here in the front row.
Michael Shabeth. I used to be involved in something called Anglia Railways. And before I ask my question, I'm going to say very briefly, I think the UK has probably one of the best, if not the best, passenger rail systems in the world. But I also think you've been stuck in a rut on this issue of fares, and none of you answered that question. They all asked for a simple answer. Not one of you. The closest was Mark, who said, make it simple in urban areas, but stop telling them about all the other fares. And David here said he agreed with that, and I thought, oh my God, because I think Mark is right, but I think voters would be the first people who would scream if they said we're going to stop telling people about all those other fares. So would anybody like to try to answer that question that person asked before, whoever it was? Do you have any idea how to make the fares simpler? It would actually ever get political support and that David wouldn't object to and every other interest group? Because you're stuck in the rut. You've been stuck in it for 20 years.
Michael, thank you. I think fair panel, they did answer what is a complicated question and were put under pressure by me as their host. And it's right, isn't it, that in any discussion of changes, there'll be differing views given the different interests that are represented. But I'll just see if there is anyone on the panel that would like to offer a further perspective.
Well, I suppose that, fundamentally one of the problems is that if you're going to make serious change to the fare structure, you're going to create winners and losers. And the Treasury is scared, witless, that it will be boxed into a corner and have to bail out all the losers so that they don't lose. And therefore, that's, in my opinion, personal view, that's why it doesn't actually go anywhere. Because it's one of these things that everyone agrees the current system is a nonsense. You never see anyone writing a paper saying, what a great structure we have for the current fare. The consequences of change are quite scary in some places, and I think people are not willing to contemplate that.
I think just to add, I think what I should have said earlier actually is being brave enough to test some things. I know there's a single leg pricing, what we're seeing in Scotland, but I think obviously maybe it's time for us to look transport focus, to look a bit more at kind of what is that changing pattern and what people need, and actually test. And I say this is back to Treasury government maybe being bolder and testing a few more of these concepts out. And if it doesn't wash its face commercially, we've learned something. But can that then be adjusted? It's what's happening in Spain and Italy with their whale and open. I don't know, but it seems to be a good example of growth, if nothing else. But maybe test a few more things out.
Okay, and there is time for a final question, which Simon Ellis is going to share with us. Thank you.
Thanks. Simon Ellis from Steer. Given all the debate about the railway in GB at the moment, it's been quite interesting to read about the challenges that Deutsche Bahn is facing at the moment. One of the criticisms levelled at it, rightly or wrongly, is that it's focused too much management effort on its international activities and rather dropped the ball on domestic investment and operations. I was wondering what the panel think the internationalisation of rail activity, if I can put it that way, has done for the passenger in GB. Has Germany's loss been our gain? What impact might it have in the future?
Thank you, Simon. Excellent question. Just looking to the panel, wondering if Mark, you might perhaps give an opening perspective on that.
I went to Germany recently and had a similar experience to the one you describe, and I sort of noticed really how radically different and worse, quite frankly, it was than, say, travelling in Austria or Switzerland. In terms of relevance to the UK, I'm not sure. There clearly is political pressure in Europe on those organisations that have become involved in railway operations overseas, and I guess it's a natural reaction, isn't it, is that the local electorate are asking why they're not getting the management focus on their own services. But I think the lessons for us are relatively limited. I think certainly when you look at places like Austria and Switzerland, what you see is a very firm commitment from across the political spectrum to long-term planning and long-term investment, and a clear plan which is delivered consistently, and I think that's probably one of the strongest lessons that we can see from Europe. Not every country in Europe benefits from that, but those that have it I think, are reaping the rewards.
I just wonder if we broaden the question to ask the panel if there are any particular aspects of international experience that we here in Great Britain could learn from. I don't know, Suzanne or Jeff, if you've any particular perspectives on those international learning points.
I think I very much agree with Mark's point there, and that it's also struck me about the World Passenger Festival that I attended, that actually in many ways Britain is doing lots of great new innovative stuff on the ground and so on, but where we're lacking is that long-term transport stroke, public strategy. And I think, we're feeling some of the effects of that right here and now. But I think that could really unlock a whole degree of growth and confidence that we just simply don't have today.
Across different aspects, safety, financial performance, environment, etc. I'd agree with Suzanne, exactly. If we had some stability around what the long-term strategy was and the money associated with it, that will make a really quite a significant difference, and it's a really big difference, is my perception, between how the situation in which we find ourselves and many international comparators.
Brilliant. That brings us to the end of this Q&A session. It actually brings us to the end of this series of the Rethink Rooms. I want to thank the panellists for their time, their honesty, their frankness, their sharing of professional and personal insights into the roles they play, the jobs they do, the experiences they've had. I think we've all benefited from that hugely, not just today, but in the prior two sessions. Thank you, panellists. What struck me from my participation in each of these three sessions, we're clearly at a time of change. Some of that change is relating to how the outside world adapts to different ways of working, different functions in our economy, different policy dimensions. Some of that change is also the rail industry looking at itself, recognising that there is a need for change. And I keep hearing a real thirst for adaptation, a real thirst to kind of explore what shape those changes should make. And I hear consistently in these sessions a recognition of the levers, the complexity, and the programme of change that's needed to bring about tangible benefits. I think we are at a really quite exciting time for the rail industry in the UK, and I think today's sharp focus on the user, the passenger, really brings home the relevance and need to get that change right. In terms of follow-up, we'd be delighted to hear any perspectives, any feedback, for any further questions to be shared with Steer. We'll be sharing a description of what has been shared across all three events, which something of the order of 700 people have participated in. That in itself, I think, has created a really rich body of insight and commentary. We've now got a short period of time for a coffee and some refreshments, so please feel free to participate. Thank you again to the panel. Thank you to everyone online. Thank you to all of you here in the room for your participation.